Hi everyone. In last video, based on consumers' utility maximization problem, we derived the demand curve, which is the relationship between the price of the good and the quantity that the consumer will choose to consume in the optimal bundle as the price changes. We also derived the relationship between the income and the quantity in the optimal bundle, and that is the angel curve. In this lecture, we are going to focus on the demand curve. We will call the impact of a price change on the quantity demanded and overall effects of the price change. We are going to decompose this overall effects into the substitution effects and income effects. There are few slides in this presentation, but most of the content will be drawing. So as I was saying, the demand curve describes what happens when the price of the good changes, what will be the quantity in the optimal bundle, that is the quantity demanded that we learn in Econ 3 changes. So when the price of a good changes, there are two things happening at the same time. First of all, the relative price of the two goods changes. So imagine if the price of good X increases and the price of good Y does not change, then relatively speaking, good X becomes more expensive than good Y. The consumer originally consuming at an optimal point would have incentive to substitute away probably good X and to consume more of good Y. We could also think of this based on the two expressions, MUX divided by PX and MUY divided by PY. So when the consumer was consuming at the optimal bundle, those two terms are supposed to be equal. If the price of good X increases, for example, then the MUX divided by PX is going to be smaller. That means the additional utility the consumer obtained from the last dollar spent on good X becomes not as high as that spent on good Y. So the consumer have the incentive to substitute to consume more of good Y and less of good X. Secondly, the purchasing power of the consumer also changes. So if we look at the original budget line, which is X times PX plus Y times PY equals her income. Now, if the price of good X increases, for example, then every point that is on the original budget line will not be on the new budget line. And we can see this from the graph here. I'm just going to draw a rather simple graph. So let's say this is the original budget line. When the price of good X increases, so this is, this is X, this is Y. Now say if the price of good X increases, then the new budget line will look something like this. So every point that is on the original budget line, which is the black line, are now outside of the new budget line, which is the green line. So basically every point on original budget line is no longer affordable, right? This also this also means that the original bundle, which would be on the original budget line, will no longer be the new optimal bundle for the reason that they are not affordable anymore. Now, if we think in another way, if the green line is the original budget line and the price of good X decreases, so now the black line will be the new budget line. Now, every point on the original budget line, which is the green line, will be inside the budget constraint of the new budget constraint, right? Which is the area inside of the black line. Now, in this case, well, the points on the green line are not spending all the income that the consumer has under the new price, which is the black line. So those points will also not be the optimal points. Therefore, this also means that the consumer will have the incentive to move away from the original optimal consumption bundle. So both of those two things happen at the same time. So the consumer is going to move from the original optimal bundle to the new optimal bundle. And we are going to decompose this movement into two effects. So the decomposition is done in the following way. And before we do it, I'm going to define a few terms. So we call the initial optimal bundle point A, which is the optimal bundle before the price changes. We call the final optimal bundle point C, which is the optimal bundle after the price changes. And we are going to define another term, intermediate optimal bundle. We call it point B. And I'm going to say how we can find point B. So to find point B, we are going to draw an imaginary budget line or intermediate budget line. And this budget line has the following two features. First of all, this budget line is tangent to the indifference curve of the initial optimal bundle. And that this budget line, this imaginary budget line, has the same slope as the final budget line, so that they are parallel to each other. And at the point at which this imaginary budget line is tangent to the initial indifference curve, is tangent to the indifference curve of the initial optimal bundle, the tangency point is the intermediate optimal point or the intermediate optimal bundle, point B, that we are looking for. This probably sounds very abstract, and I'm going to draw all of those on the graph, which will become clearer later on. And because point B is the tangency point of this imaginary budget line to the indifference curve of the initial optimal bundle. So point B is also on the indifference curve of the initial optimal bundle. Or to say that point B gives the consumer the same level of utility as point A does. So moving from point A to point B, the utility of the consumer does not change. And because point B is the tangency point of this imaginary budget line, it is an optimal bundle to the new price ratio, because this imaginary budget line is parallel to the final budget line. So the final budget line has the slope of the new price ratio. And let's go to the graph, and just remember, by substitution effect, we mean that the effect moving from point A to point B, and by income effect, we mean the effect of moving from point B to point C. So the overall effect is moving from the initial point to the final point, which is from point A to point C. All right. So let's first draw the graph for this decomposition for a normal good. So let's say this red line is the original budget line. So let's call it budget line 1. And let me draw the initial indifference curve now. it's difficult to draw. This is a graph that is not easy to draw even on a whiteboard. All right, this one is slightly better. So this point is our point A, the initial optimal bundle, point A. This is our initial budget line, and let's say the utility level at this that point A has is U1. So now let's suppose the price of grid X decreases. So suppose price of grid X decreases. Now as Px becomes smaller, the new budget line will have the same y-intercept because Py did not change. And as Px becomes smaller, the person will be able to purchase a higher amount of grid X if she spent all her income purchasing grid X. So the x-intercept becomes larger. The new budget line looks something like this. So this is our budget line 2. Now, to do what I described just now, I'm going to, let me type it here. I'm going to find an imaginary budget line. And this imaginary budget line satisfies the following two conditions. First of all, it is tangent. It is tangent to U1. And secondly, it is parallel to the new budget line, which is our BL2. I'm going to find an imaginary budget line satisfying these two conditions. And there are actually only one budget line here. I mean, there are only one possible budget line that we can draw satisfying those requirements. The budget line would be something like this. This blue line is our imaginary budget line. So this is our imaginary budget line, the blue line. So this blue line is both tangent to U1 at point here. And this is our point B, right? Because point B is defined as the point at which our imaginary budget line is tangent to the indifference curve. Our imaginary budget line is also parallel to our new budget line, that is BL2, the green line. Now let's draw the indifference curve. Let's draw the optimal bundle after the price of the good, after Px decreases. And here we are assuming that the good is a normal good, right? So because the good is a normal good, when your income increases, the consumption of the good will increase, right? So the new optimal point is possibly around here, and the indifference curves might look something like this. Oops. All right. This is our U2, the indifference curve that the new budget line is tangent to. And this point will be our point C. So now, if we make some supplementary lines over here, those 3 points, I'm going to call the first one XA, this one XB, and the last one XC. So all of those 3 points are optimal bundles to some budget constraint. Point A is the optimal bundle to our original budget constraint, BL1. Point B is an optimal bundle to the intermediate budget line or the imaginary budget line, that is the blue line. And lastly, the point C is the optimal point to the new budget line or the final budget line. So moving from point A to point B, the consumer is on the same indifference curve, that is U1. And the consumer is only making a response to the relative price ratio between good A and good Y. The consumer's utility is held the same. So we call this movement from XA to XB the income effect. So in this case, the income effect is XB minus XA. Oops, sorry, this is a substitution effect. It's a typo. So the substitution effect is moving from point A to point B so that it is XB minus XA. So only the price ratio changes. The consumer is substituting between the two goods, but her overall level of satisfaction does not change. Moving from point B to point C is our income effect. And that is XC minus XB. So moving from this imaginary budget line to our new budget line, because they are parallel, the price ratio did not change. The relative price of the two goods are the same. It's only that this person's purchasing power has increased as a result from the decrease of price in good X, right? So it is a parallel shift of the budget line from the blue line to the green line. And the change in the amount of good X consumed by this individual, which is moving from point XB to point XC, the difference of those two is income effects. And because we are assuming the good is a normal good, we defined at the end of last lecture, for a normal good, the income effect would be positive. And I didn't say previously, which I should have, the substitution effect is always positive as long as the indifference curves are negatively sloped. So I should have said that the substitution effect is positive as long as indifference curves has negative slope. Now the income effect is positive when X is a normal good, which we assumed over here, right? And just be aware that the sign, that whether it is positive or negative. So here we're assuming that it is the price of X decreases, right? So only when pH decreases, this is positive, this is positive. If pH increases, then this will be negative, this will be negative. All right, so this is what happens when it's a normal good. And I planned to erase all of this and move to the next slide, which we will talk about inferior good. But I think I won't be able to draw a graph better as good as this one, although this is not good enough still. So I'm going to erase only part of the stuff I've drawn because many of them are actually the same, and I'm going to keep it, okay? So what's going to change is if the good, instead of being a normal good, becomes an inferior good, then, well, it means that the preference of the people becomes different. So the indifference curves will become different. And more specifically, what matters is well, the indifference curve U2 looks like. So I'm going to erase that part and change it. So now let's suppose, oops. Well, the original budget line is still the same. This imaginary budget line is also the same. But instead of being a normal good, good X is actually an inferior good, which means when your income increases, your consumption of the good 2 will decrease. Now, what does that might look like? So the new indifference curve, instead of being tangent to the BL2 at a point that is to the right of point B, it might be tangent to this indifference curve at a point that is to the left of point B. Let's say it is somewhere here. The indifference curve might look something like this. All right. The indifference curve might look something like this. So now we have a point C that is located to the left of our point B. So in this case, well, the substitution effect is the same, as that does not depend on whether the good is normal good or inferior good. So the sign of the substitution effect is determined as long as the indifference curve are negative sloped. What changes is the income effect. So when the good is inferior good, and I should have crossed out over here, cross out over here and say we are looking at inferior good now. When we look at inferior good, as income increases, the consumption of good X actually decreases. So the income effects moving from point B to point C would mean that the income effect is negative. And note that here, the only thing that changes is the price of good X. The actual income of the person did not change. It is because that the price of good X decreases, the purchasing power of the person increases, so that it is as if the person's income has increased. And that is why the income effect makes a difference over here, all right? And actually, this person's actual income is held constant. It does not change. It is a decrease in the price of good X. So based on this graph, we can reach the conclusion that the income effect, which is xc minus xb, it is going to be negative, and s is an inferior good. Inferior good. So the sign of this income effect obviously depends on whether the good is normal good or inferior good. So now what can we say about overall effect? The overall effect, which is the adding the substitution effect to the income effect, right? So the overall effect is the substitution effect plus the income effect. What can we say about this term? Well, it's quite obvious that when this good is a normal good, both the substitution effect and the income effect are positive. Therefore, the overall effect must be positive if the good is a normal good. So the overall effect is positive if when x is a normal good. We can reach this conclusion. And the overall effect is going to be ambiguous. It is going to be undetermined, right? So the overall effect is going to be undetermined when x is an inferior good. So we can reach those two conclusions. Now, let's go a little bit more extreme than this. So here, point C is to the left of point B, but it is still to the right of point A. What if point C is even to the left of point A? So the income effect is not only negative, but it is so strong that it outweighs the substitution effect. Let's draw the graph for that. So I'm again erasing this indifference curve and I'm going to draw a new one. So now let's suppose the optimal point happens at here. So let's say the indifference curve U2 looks like this. So this is our U2 now. Then this optimal point, point C, lying here, and the point XC is going to be down here. So what is going on over here? This is saying that the income effect is not only negative, but it is so large that in absolute value, it is even larger than the substitution effect. Now, in this case, well, the income effect is still negative, right? So the good must still be an inferior good. And previously, the overall effect is undetermined when X is an inferior good, because the possibility of this kind of situations. So by only saying that the good is an inferior good, the graph that we previously draw, the second graph we draw, might be the case, while this graph might also be the case. We cannot be certain which one exactly is the case. So what is special in this case is that, and I'm going to write down over here, and let me emphasize again that this term negative here, And this term, negative here, really depends on whether we are looking at a price increase or price decrease, all right? So if the price is increase, all those will become the opposite. So here, when the negative income effect is so large, such that it is larger than the substitution effect, the overall effect is negative. And why this is an interesting case? So let's see, we are looking at a decrease in the price of good X, right? So the price of the good X decreases. And what we observe is that the individual's consumption of the good becomes lower. XC is smaller than XA. And forget about all the terms. This is saying that in real life, when the price of some good becomes lower, you are consuming less of that good. Or, contrarily, when the price of the good becomes higher, you are consuming more of that good. This is highly counterintuitive, right? But theoretically, this can possibly exist. So economists have been searching for this type of good, whether this kind of phenomenon was observed in history, that when the price of certain good becomes higher, people consume more of that good and vice versa. So economists have been searching for this type of phenomenon, and you can look at the textbook for a more detailed explanation. So there is a name for this type of good, which is called driven good. This is this does not satisfy what we usually think about people's demand curve. So here, as the price increases, you consume more. As the price decreases, you consume less. Your demand curve is positively sloped, right? It is different from what we described previously and what we commonly think, that is that the demand curves are going to be negatively sloped in reality. So I've drawn quite a few graphs and I have been recycling my graph. You can take like screenshots at different stages if that helps. And you can take notes. I think taking notes is the best because my screen is not as good as it should be. I have been writing everywhere as I'm moving on. So this is the decomposition of the substitution effects and income effects. And let me restate the process. So to do this decomposition, we are moving from point A to point C, which is, so when the price of good X decreases, the budget line changes from our BL1 to BL2. The optimal bundle moves from point A to point C, as those two are the points where the two budget line is tangent to our indifference curves. And to do the decomposition, we are going to find an imaginary budget line, our blue budget line, BL imaginary. And this imaginary budget line has to be tangent to the indifference curve that passes through our original optimal bundle, which is point A. And also, this imaginary budget line has to be parallel to our new budget line, which is BL2. So on the graph, this is the blue line that we draw. And the point at which this imaginary budget line is tangent to our U1 is the point B, that is the intermediate optimal bundle. And we say that we decompose our overall effect, which is the effect which is the effect of moving from point A to point C. We are decomposing this effect into the substitution effect and income effect. And basically, the substitution effect is moving from point A to point B, while the income effect is moving from point B to point C. Now, the substitution effect is going to be, the sign of the substitution effect is determined. And it depends, of course, on whether the it is a price increase or price decrease, but the sign of substitution, effect is determined. The income effect may be positive or negative, depending on whether the good is normal good or inferior good. And recall in the last lecture, we said that if your consumption of the good increases as your income increases, which corresponds to the case that your angel curve has a positive slope, then the income effect, then we say that this is a normal good, right? And the income effects for normal good are going to be positive. Conversely, if you are going to consume less of the good, if your income increases, then your income effect to the good is going to be negative. And again, the positivity and the negativity here depends on whether it is a price increase or price decrease. Next, the overall effect is the sign of the overall effect is going to be determined if good X is a normal good, because the income effect and the substitution effect will have the same sign. However, if the good X is an inferior good, then the overall effect is going to be undetermined, because the substitution effect and the income effect have opposite signs. And in an extreme case, when the income effect is so large, such that it is larger than the substitution effect in absolute value, then the overall effect, the sign of the overall effect can be determined. And in this case, we are observing a positively sloped demand curve, which is very weird to our common sense, but theoretically possible. And we give a special name to this type of good, or good that has this type of feature. We call them different good. Oops, let me clear the drawings here. All right, this is the second extra credit question for this week. So let's say, suppose X is a normal good and the price of X increases. So what we did just now is that when the price of X decreases, right? Here, the price of X increases, and we are asking what is the sign of the substitution effect and what is the sign of the income effect. So you can take a screenshot of this slide and submit your answer on iLearn for extra credit, okay? All right, we are ready to summarize this lecture. So I've been talking about substitution effect and income effect, but I haven't given them a definition yet, because I think they are much more easy to understand on the graph than by those words. But now we are ready to go to the description of it. So the substitution effect is the change in the amount of the good that you consume when the price of the good changes, or the relative price of the goods changes, while holding the, so here it says holding other prices constant. All right, so most importantly, it is holding the level of utility constant. And the income effect is the change in the amount of good that you consume, you would choose to purchase when your purchasing power changes, which basically means when your income changes. So, well, sorry. So I will try to not confuse you. Your actual income does not change. So it is your purchasing power changes. And the purchasing power change is a result from the change in the price of the good. And here, this income effect is holding the prices constant. So we are moving from the imaginary budget line we draw previously to the final budget line. And those two budget lines are parallel. They have the same price ratio. It's only a change in the purchasing power. So I hope after drawing those graphs, you are feeling more comfortable. You have a more straightforward understanding of those two definitions or those two statements. All right. And lastly, we talked about a special kind of good, which is driven good. And a driven good has an upward sloping demand curve, or to say that when the price of the good increases, consumers are consuming more of the good, while when the price of the good decreases, consumers are consuming less of the good. This is only possible when the income effect is negative and it is larger than the substitution effect. So I probably shouldn't have put negative over here. I will change the slide I upload onto iLearn later on to make this more precise. It's the statement here, just plainly speaking, is imprecise and incorrect. So the income effect must be of the opposite sign of the substitution effect and is larger than that for the good to be possibly be a driven good. All right. And the second one is correct. The driven good must be an inferior good. So let me type first what is correct over here, and I will make this change. So the income effect must be of opposite sign and larger. Must be of opposite sign of and larger than the substitution effect. So I put negative because the example I've been using is when the price decrease. So here, it should actually be that the income effect must be of the opposite sign and larger than the substitution effect for the good to be a different good. This should replace the first line. All right. So this is all for this video.